What's up guys, CGKFPV here. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I am going to go through a little bit of kind of how I set up my GoPro Session 5 to get that good footage. There's a few basics that I'm going to go through here that break down ISO, shutter speed, and frames per second. Those three things are the elements that we kind of tweak and change the values of to get that right shutter speed. That's the reason why we're doing all of this, is to get the right shutter speed. And the reason we're doing that is because if you hold your hand up and you kind of wave your hand in front of your face, you'll see that it kind of blurs. It's not crisp. There's a slight motion blur. There's like, you can see through your hand. There's like a bunch of fingers. And that's what we're trying to emulate when we take the video in our cameras. The good rule to follow is you basically double your frame rate. So if I have 24 frames per second, you're gonna wanna shoot at 1/48th of a second. So it's still pretty fast, but it's just enough to where you get that nice motion blur. If your shutter speed is too fast, say your shutter speed is 250ths of a second, your video is gonna look kind of unnatural. It can look too crisp, and that can be because it's not really what our natural eye sees. And if you freeze frame the video, there's no motion blur. It's like each frame of the video is stop motion. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you'll want 1/60th of a second shutter speed. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, you're gonna want 1/120th second of a shutter speed, and so on. For everything that I do, I shoot 24 frames per second, so my shutter speed needs to be 1/48th of a second shutter speed. And to accomplish that, we use ND filters. ND filters are basically like sunglasses for our cameras. If you're shooting at sunset and you have 24 frames per second and you want that 1/48th second shutter speed, you have to use an ND filter, because without the ND filter, that slow shutter speed is going to let way too much light into your camera, and your footage is basically just going to be blown out. You're not going to be able to see. It's just going to be white. You won't see anything. But if you slap an ND filter on there, that's what's going to allow the camera to keep that slow shutter speed and enable you to get that nice motion blur that you want. So here's an example of nice shutter speed, silky smooth footage with an ND filter. And then now I'm going to show you what it looks like without an ND filter, and you can instantly see that jello, and that's one of the effects of having a shutter speed that's too fast and when it's too bright. So check that out. So as you can see, it's much nicer having that slow, nice motion blur where it kind of emulates how we see things in real life. And basically that's the whole goal. So now that I've kind of explained that, I'm going to go through my GoPro settings on the phone and show you exactly how I set it up, the different times that I'll use certain techniques. Let's go ahead and dive into that and take a look how that works. Okay, so here's my camera. Let's go ahead and connect that. All right, and as you can see, it is really dark. So here's how I have my thing set up, and I'll have it set up like this all the time. So how it's set up here is I set it up like this once, and then there's just a few things that I'll go in and change when I go out and fly, depending on the light, the weather, the cloud coverage. So first thing is resolution. I shoot at 2.7K because that's the highest resolution I can get if I want Superview. Superview is really wide angle that just makes our FPV footage look so sick when you're flying through trees and doing those juicy flicks. It really brings some dimension into the flight. Frames per second, 24 frames per second. That's what I always shoot because I've been into kind of filming for a while, and 24 frames per second is like the cinematic frames per second that you want to use. So that's what I use. If you like 30 frames per second, you can go ahead and use 30. If you want to use 48, you can use 48. I am going to go ahead and use 24. Field of view, Superview, video stabilization. I never have any sort of video stabilization. There's two reasons for that. One is that the stabilization in the Session 5 is not that great. So I've seen it produce some weird, shaky video sometimes. I thought it was my tune. I had no idea what was going on. But eventually found out that it's the stabilization in the Session, so I turn it off. And also, that kind of gives you, I don't know, there's no like buffer. What you see is the stick's input, and that's kind of translates into the video. So the better you're flying, the better your video is going to be. And that kind of, I don't know, that makes me proud of my video. But of course, y'all use video stabilization. There's no right or wrong with that. It's however you want to make your video. Spot meter, I don't use the spot meter because that is kind of annoying. Protune I leave on because that's how we're going to access all these different features that we need to tweak when we're doing this kind of calibration for the light. So I leave that on, and you can see that we get these few options pop up here. So white balance, I set at 5500 Kelvin just because it seems to work the best in most situations. And color, I kind of bounce between flat and GoPro color. There are certain LUTs that work better with the flat GoPro color, and there's certain ones that work better with the GoPro color. So I tend to use it on the GoPro color. If I do need to desaturate it to add a better LUT, I'll do that post. So here we go. Now into the shutter speed. So let's start off with just, oops. Okay, so let's say we're at sunset and we're about to go fly. We're not at sunset, but say 45 minutes, 30 minutes before, at that golden hour, crucial time to go fly. First thing I try to do is to get the shutter speed that I want, which is 1/48 of a second. There's an ISO mode here, lock or max. I'm going to use lock because this way I can really hone in on the exposure that I want. If I'm shooting at sunset, I have 1/48 of a second. I'll set my ISO to the lowest I possibly can, and you know what? I'm going to be right back. All right, guys, so here we go. You see this footage here now is out front of my house. That's with ISO 100. It's super cloudy out right now. It's in the middle of the day though. But ISO at 200, you can see the sky gets kind of blown out. So for me, ISO 200 would be too much. And if I raise up the sensor even more and make the ISO even more sensitive to light, you can see now we're starting to lose parts of the building on the left, and I'll crank it up even more to 800, and now we're losing almost everything, and I'm assuming if I go to 1600, we won't be able to see much at all. So hopefully this kind of shows you an example of what I mean. Like I said before, you want the lowest ISO you can get. So I'm gonna go to 100, and what I try to expose for is make sure that the shadows, I can see some information in the shadows. I can see a little bit of information in the sky there. So this might be a good place for me to go fly. If I'm at the lowest ISO and it's still too bright, that means I have to put a darker ND filter. So what I have on now is an ND16, which is I think about 2 or 3. Let's not get into that. I think this is an ND16, so the next step would be an ND32, where if I put that on, I would probably have to crank the ISO up a little. If I put a 32 on here and had it at ISO 100, I'm pretty sure it would be too dark. So I would have to go into the app and probably raise the ISO maybe to 200 or 400. But that way I am correctly exposed and I can get that good shutter speed. Huge tip, I never go over ISO 400, to be honest. As soon as you go into 800 and 1600 ISO, the video gets really grainy, and if you're watching it on a big screen or a desktop, that really shows through in the video. So max ISO I go is 400. If I can shoot at 100 or 200, that's even better, because in post, if it is too dark and you've shot at that low ISO, you can crank down the shadows or lighten the shadows without getting that noise that you would if you had the ISO cranked up way high. If you don't want to go through the ISO and keep tweaking to get just that right feel and look that you want, instead of setting the shutter speed to 1/48th, just put it to auto, but make sure you have an ND filter and you know which ND filter is going to work. That can be a little bit easier. You won't have as much control. You won't have that 1/48th second shutter speed, but you'll have close enough to where your footage won't have jello in it, and you will still have some motion blur as long as you have the correct ND filter. If you want to use the auto setting, check out my spreadsheet, and it's going to give you basically a good baseline of what ND filter you want at what time of the day, depending on the weather. So actually, we can take a look here. When I went to auto, you can see that much more of the sky got developed in the image, and that's because the shutter speed was lowered. So immediately we can tell that this is a little bit overexposed. But sometimes you sacrifice a little bit of the sky if you want that good motion blur. But again, auto with an ND16 is pretty perfect. And if you want, you can add a little bit of exposure value compensation here. I re-exposed the sky a little bit more, or you can go the other way. I suggest leaving that at 0 if you're at auto. So anyways, guys, I hope that has helped. You can see it's actually pretty windy out today. I was going to go fly, but it looks like I won't be doing that. And hopefully I didn't forget anything. If I did, leave me a comment. Let me know if you have any questions or any specifics that I didn't cover. Be glad to help you and answer them. I hope you guys have a good week, and I will see you guys on the next one. When am I going to post this? I'll post it tomorrow.